In 1883, in the dense backwoods of Johnson County, Missouri, a federal census taker documented a family that would be systematically erased from American history. His journey into the rugged hill country was meant to be routine, another line item in the nation's grand project of self-measurement. The farmstead he found, marked only by a leaning gatepost and a perimeter of decaying fence rails, belonged to the Hensley family. It was a household that should have been simple to record: names, ages, relationships, the basic arithmetic of a growing republic. But the ledger he filled out that summer afternoon became a document of impossibility. Ages repeated themselves in adjacent lines. Names appeared, were struck through, and then reappeared with minor variations, as if the people standing before him were shifting forms. In the margin of his official record, next to the chaotic scrawl of entries, the census taker wrote a single, damning word: irregular. Days after his visit, he submitted a letter of resignation to the county clerk, stating that his enumeration of the Southern Territory was incomplete and would remain so. He refused to go back to that house. From that moment forward, the official record of the Hensley family was never a history, but a collection of fragments, contradictions, and deliberate omissions. Their story is not one of lineage, but of a pattern that defied nature, a mystery so profound that every institution that encountered it, government, church, and medicine, chose not to document, but to erase. What happened in that isolated farmhouse that drove a man of duty to abandon his post? The original 1883 census ledger for Johnson County, Missouri, is a ghost in the state archives. Of the hundreds of pages detailing the lives of farmers, merchants, and freedmen, only a few from the southern district survive, their edges brittle and water-stained. Among them is the page for the Hensley household, and it is a testament to confusion. The family name is listed not once, but 3 separate times, each entry a battleground of ink. The first attempt lists 21 individuals. Heavy black lines are drawn through it. The second attempt lists 17, but this too is crossed out, the pen strokes angry and decisive. The final, grudging entry lists only 11, but even here the order collapses. A son, Thomas, is marked as age 12. In the very next line, another son, also named Thomas, is listed as 12. A daughter, Sarah, age 9, appears beside another Sarah, also 9. The record makes no mention of twins, an annotation that would have been standard practice. The duplication is messy, the numbers written as if the census taker's hand was shaking. In the margins, his notes betray a growing panic. First, the word duplicate, then a more forceful strike. Finally, beneath a blot of ink is the phrase that sealed the family's fate: irregular repetition. The very purpose of a census was to impose order on a sprawling nation, to count and categorize every soul under a government's watchful eye. It was an instrument of certainty. Yet the Hensley page radiates a profound uncertainty, a sense of a reality so fluid that it could not be pinned down by official ink. This was not a simple clerical error. Errors were common and corrected with simple notations. This was a document of recoil. The struck-out lines are not corrections. They are retractions, as if the recorder saw something that he later felt compelled to deny. The page itself seems to whisper the question that led to its author's resignation. What do you record when a family refuses to add up? The strangeness of the Hensley census entry did not go unnoticed. As the ledger made its way from the field to the county seat and eventually to federal classifiers, it left a trail of bureaucratic confusion. County clerks, accustomed to the neat columns of rural life, attached questioning slips to the page, their cursive script a stark contrast to the census taker's frantic scrawl. Why, one note asks, does the household count fluctuate so drastically? From 21 to 17 to 11, please clarify. No clarification ever came. Another memo points to the recycling of names. Hensley, 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 it reads, as though the recorder himself could not decide who stood before him. The supplemental forms that should have accompanied the entry are conspicuously absent. The household schedule, a detailed form listing livestock, acreage, and crop yields, the measure of a farm's contribution to the nation, is missing entirely. It's as if the family's physical presence on the land was erased along with their identities. Decades later, when the federal government began microfilming census records in the 1930s for permanent preservation, the Hensley family vanished completely. State summaries of agricultural output from that period list no farm under their name. Federal copies of the 1883 census simply omit the page. It is a deliberate, systematic excision. The family was noted, questioned, and then scrubbed from the national memory. All that is left are the ghosts, the indentations in the original page where the pen pressed too hard, the faint outline of a name struck through with such force that it tore the paper, and the formal yet trembling resignation letter of a man whose job was to measure and count, but who encountered something that he refused to measure further. The official silence hardened into an undeniable fact. The United States government had looked upon the Hensley family and chosen to pretend they never existed. To understand the gravity of this erasure, one must understand the America of 1883. The nation was still healing from the deep wounds of the Civil War, a conflict that had torn families and communities apart. The census of that era was more than just a headcount. It was a political and social tool, a way for the federal government to reassert its authority and stitch the country back together. It was designed to capture a nation in profound transition, immigrants pouring in from Europe, freed slaves building new lives in the South, and soldiers returning to farms across the Midwest. Every name entered into the ledger was a declaration that they belonged, that they were part of the fabric of the United States. In rural Missouri, a border state that had seen some of the war's most brutal guerrilla fighting, this act of counting was especially significant. It was a way to impose order after years of chaos, to affirm that civilization and governance had returned to the wild frontier. The census taker was an agent of that order. He carried the weight of federal authority in his satchel, his ink and paper a means of transforming scattered, isolated homesteads into a coherent, quantifiable part of the national whole. His job was to make the unknown known, to render the irregular regular. The Hensley family represented a catastrophic failure of this mission. They were an anomaly the system was not built to accommodate. A household that seemed to repeat itself, children who shared ages but were not twins, names that looped back as if the family line was not a line at all, but a circle. To record what he saw would have been to admit a crack in the very foundation of the project. It would have meant submitting a report that defied biological and social logic. So, faced with a reality that his ledger could not contain, he, and the system after him, made a choice. They chose silence. The question that echoes through the empty spaces in the archive is not just what he saw, but why that sight was so threatening that erasure became the only option. In the late 19th century, photography was a kind of magic. It was not an art form for the masses, but a scientific marvel, a way to fix a moment in time with a permanence that memory could never achieve. The daguerreotype, with its ghostly image captured on a sheet of silver-plated copper, was treated as irrefutable evidence. For most families in rural America, a portrait was a solemn occasion, a way to document their lineage and mark the passage of time. Children were photographed as they grew, their faces slowly weathering into the features of their parents, creating a visible chain of inheritance across decades. These portraits affirmed the natural order of life: birth, growth, aging, death. But the photographic record of the Hensley family tells a different story. It doesn't show growth, it shows repetition. The earliest surviving plate, dated 1871 and kept in the climate-controlled vault of the County Historical Society, shows a man identified as John Hensley. He is seated, his features narrow and severe, his hair parted neatly down the middle. It is an unremarkable portrait for the era. But a second plate, dated 12 years later in 1883, captioned Thomas, son of John, is where the unease begins. The face staring out from the silvered plate is not just similar to the first, it is, to the naked eye, identical. The same high cheekbones, the same precise distance between the eyes, the same slight downturn of the mouth. Only the collar of the shirt has changed, a small concession to fashion that makes the biological stillness even more jarring. This wasn't a family resemblance, it was a replica. And as more images surfaced, the pattern became undeniable, suggesting something far more disturbing than a strong family gene pool. The unsettling likeness between the portraits of John and Thomas Hensley was not a subjective impression. In the 1960s, archivists at the Missouri State Historical Society conducted a forensic comparison. They created high-resolution reproductions of the two daguerreotypes and, using precise calipers and overlay techniques, mapped the facial features. The alignment was nearly perfect. The distance from the pupil to the bridge of the nose, the width of the mouth, the angle of the jaw, the measurements were identical to within a fraction of a millimeter. One archivist wrote in his notes, "It is as if the same man sat for two portraits, 12 years apart, without aging a single day." This visual stagnation was corroborated by the scattered oral testimonies gathered decades later. Locals who lived on the surrounding farms struggled to tell the Hensley generations apart. A visiting minister, in a letter to his diocese in 1885, complained of the confusion. "The children appear as their fathers, and their fathers as their fathers yet again," he wrote. "I asked the eldest boy's name and was told 3 at once. They all looked the same." This wasn't the fond exaggeration of a neighbor remarking on a family likeness. It was a statement of genuine bewilderment, a recurring theme in every account of the family. The Works Progress Administration interviews of the 1930s, designed to capture the fading memories of rural America, contained similar refrains. Neighbors remembered the family only by the moniker, the same-faced ones, remarking that a Hensley child who entered the schoolhouse in 1890 could not be distinguished from one who had graduated years before. The photographs do more than just support these claims. They amplify the unease, providing cold, chemical proof of a phenomenon that defies easy explanation. A series of glass plate negatives, discovered in a box of unlabeled photographs from a defunct Warrensburg studio, deepens the mystery. Taken sometime in the late 1880s, they show family groupings posed stiffly outside the dilapidated Hensley farmhouse. In one image, a father and his two sons stand side by side. All three appear to be of a similar age, their faces so precisely matched that without the context of family, they could be triplets. The lines of age that should distinguish a father from his sons, wrinkles, a slackening of the skin, the graying of hair, are entirely absent. The photographer, clearly aware of the confusion, made a desperate attempt to impose order. Using a fine-tipped tool, he scratched annotations directly onto the glass negative, labeling one figure senior and another junior. But the labels feel arbitrary, a forced distinction applied to an undifferentiated reality. The effect is profoundly unsettling, not because of any obvious deformity, but because of the chilling absence of variation. Human faces, even within the closest of families, are meant to carry the subtle marks of individuality. The Hensley archive suggests a collapse of that individuality. It is as if one face was simply reprinted across decades, the camera compelled to capture the same subject no matter who was standing before it. Even in death, this eerie repetition persisted. Parish notes from the 1890s, documenting funeral rites, remark on the strange difficulty of telling the deceased apart from the living. A priest wrote that he could not reconcile the features of a deceased father with those of his surviving son, for they were the same. The stillness of the daguerreotypes becomes a kind of accusation. These were not casual likenesses, they were deliberate echoes, each plate eroding the assumption that time moves forward and that a son is always distinct from his father. If photographs freeze a moment in time, the Hensley photographs suggest that for this family time itself had faltered. The images present a continuum without change, faces replicated like imprints from a single mold, not lives unfolding. In most family archives, portraits serve to prove that time has passed. They are a comforting affirmation of growth, change, and the continuation of a bloodline. The Hensley portraits do the opposite. They suggest that perhaps no moment had ever truly moved forward at all. This lack of distinction created a kind of social blindness in those who encountered them. The parish priest who left his funeral register incomplete, closing the entry with a dash instead of a signature, was not merely being careless. He was refusing to officiate over a reality he could not comprehend. His refusal to sign was a refusal to validate what he had seen, a dead man whose face was identical to the son who mourned him. This visual evidence forces us to confront the core of the mystery. Was this an extreme, one-in-a-billion genetic quirk, a family of doppelgangers produced by a fluke of inheritance? Or were the photographs capturing something else, a phenomenon that wasn't just biological but temporal? The images sit in their archival boxes, silent and unblinking, challenging the very laws of identity. They ask a question that science and history have yet to answer. If a photograph is proof of a life lived, what does it mean when the proof never changes? The visual record, meant to bring clarity, only drags us deeper into the heart of the enigma, leaving us with the chilling possibility that the duplication seen by the census taker was not a clerical error, but a literal truth. The parish records of St. Matthew's Church in Johnson County were meant to be a testament to order and divine certainty. For centuries, the church had been the primary record keeper of human life, its ledgers filled with the steady, predictable rhythm of baptisms, marriages, and burials. Names were entered in tidy columns, followed by dates, the signatures of priests and sponsors grounding each soul in a specific time and place. For most families, the pattern was a clear, unbroken line from the cradle to the grave. But when the Hensley name appears in these books, the rhythm fractures, and the pages themselves seem to become a landscape of confusion and doubt. The first clear irregularity surfaces in 1875. A child named Samuel Hensley was baptized in March, his age noted as 3 months. The entry is standard, with 2 sponsors listed and the priest's signature closing the line. But several pages later in the same year, a second entry appears. Another Samuel Hensley, also recorded as 3 months old, was baptized in July. The handwriting is identical, the priest is the same, but the sponsors are different. Neither entry is crossed out. Both exist as parallel, contradictory facts, as though the parish had baptized 2 identical infants, born to the same family, within months of each other. This was not a simple mistake of a name being entered twice. The different dates and sponsors indicate 2 separate ceremonies. This pattern of impossible duplication was just the beginning of the clerical chaos that the Hensley family would wreak upon the sacred records of St. Matthew's. The duplication in the baptismal register continued with unnerving consistency in the years that followed. In 1878, a Mary Hensley was baptized, her date of birth listed as January of that year. 3 years later, in 1881, another Mary Hensley appears in the log. Her parents are listed as the same, yet her birth is once again recorded as January 1878. A later clerk, attempting to resolve the contradiction, tried to overwrite the date on the second entry, changing the year to 1881 in darker ink. But the original entry is still visible beneath the correction, a ghost of the first date refusing to be erased. Side by side, the names suggest not an error, but a persistent, cyclical reality that the ledger was struggling to contain. Even the erasures themselves carry a sense of unease. In 1881, a Thomas Hensley was entered into the baptismal register, only to be crossed out with a single, heavy stroke of black ink. Yet in the margin, faintly visible in pencil as if written in secret, the name Thomas is written again. Parish officials later attempted to obscure the confusing entry entirely by pressing a thick wafer of paste over it, leaving behind a raised, discolored blister on the page that, even today, is sensitive to the touch. This was not record-keeping. It was a desperate act of concealment. The frustration of the clergy is palpable. A surviving note, pinned to the inside cover of the 1880s ledger, gives voice to their struggle. Unsigned, it reads, "This family causes no end of repetition. The names reappear against time itself. It is not my hand that errs, but theirs." That statement transforms the ledger from a simple book of records into a battleground between human order and an inexplicable phenomenon. For the Hensleys, this repetition wasn't confined to a single generation. It seemed to stretch across time, collapsing the very notion of lineage. A man listed as a baptismal sponsor named John Hensley in 1869 appears again as a sponsor named John Hensley in 1885. There is no indication of death or succession, no marker to distinguish one man from the other. Parish tradition and indeed common sense would normally distinguish such entries with titles like senior or junior, or the elder and the younger. In the Hensley case, no such markers exist. Fathers and sons, uncles and nephews all seem to collapse into the same line, identical in name and apparently in social function. To a clerk's eye, the work became an impossible tangle of duplication. The expected comforting monotony of the ledger, the steady march of names and years, was broken by these echoes that returned with an insistence that bordered on the supernatural. Names were written, erased, and written again. Dates were overwritten but remained stubbornly legible. Infants seemed to be baptized twice, or perhaps never at all, depending on which layer of ink the reader chose to trust. What is most unsettling is not the possibility of a single error, but the persistence of the pattern. Over decades, across the tenures of several different priests and clerks, each acting independently, the same mistakes recurred with chilling precision. It was as though the ledger itself, the very paper and ink, demanded the repetition. By the turn of the century, the parish seemed to give up. The Hensley pages become brittle with revisions, ink layered upon ink, until finally the entries stop altogether. Entire years are left blank, silent pages where no Hensley baptisms are listed, as if the church itself chose to withdraw its acknowledgement of their existence. The blank pages in the St. Matthew's Register are more eloquent than any written entry. They represent an institutional surrender. Faced with a pattern it could not explain, the church chose to create a void, a deliberate silence where a family's sacred history should be. This act of omission mirrors the erasure seen in the census records, suggesting a coordinated, if unspoken, consensus among institutions of authority. The Hensley family was a problem that could not be solved, only ignored. This raises a deeply disturbing question. Were these truly clerical mistakes that accumulated by chance, a cascade of human error across decades? Or were they deliberate cover-ups, acts of concealment performed by men of God to hide a pattern that they believed was unnatural or worse, unholy? The frantic overwriting, the paste-covered entries, the unsigned notes of frustration, they all point away from simple error. They suggest a conscious struggle to contain something that threatened the very order the church was meant to represent. The sacred records, which were supposed to provide a clear and unambiguous account of a soul's journey through the Christian world, became a testament to ambiguity and contradiction. The Hensleys broke the ledger. Their existence created paradoxes that ink and paper could not resolve. The church, founded on the principle of a singular, linear history from creation to judgment, was confronted with a family that appeared to exist in a loop. Did the clergy of St. Matthew's believe they were dealing with mere human eccentricity, or did they fear they had encountered something that defied the laws of God Himself? The silence of the final pages offers no answer, only a chilling space for speculation. Rural medicine in the 1880s was a profession built on routine and pragmatism. Physicians kept ledgers as faithfully as clergymen kept parish books. Births, deaths, illnesses, and treatments were noted in precise, methodical columns. For Dr. Elias Whitcomb of Johnson County, Missouri, this record-keeping was both a professional habit and the tangible proof of his labor across the scattered, isolated farms of the region. His handwriting, preserved in the county medical ledger, is steady and confident across hundreds of cases. Each entry follows the same formula: date, patient's name, condition observed, remedy prescribed, and his signature, EW, in careful, looping cursive. But in the spring of 1883, the same year the census taker fled his post, the pages of Dr. Whitcomb's ledger break their pattern. A birth is recorded at the Hensley farmstead. The line lists the mother's name, Sarah Hensley, the date of delivery, and the expected notations of a healthy birth. But the signature line where Dr. Whitcomb's initials should stand is conspicuously blank. Beneath it, a faint, smudged mark is visible, the ghost of ink that once touched the paper and was then deliberately blotted out. The column ends in an unnerving silence, as though the record itself resisted completion. This was not a singular oversight. Over the next decade, at least 4 more Hensley births appear in the county ledger, all attended by Dr. Whitcomb. Each one follows the same disturbing trajectory. Initial details are entered, but no signature is ever appended. On 2 occasions, the ink trails off mid-word, the pen lifted from the page before closing the entry. In an 1887 case, the baby's sex is not even recorded, an omission almost unheard of in that era, a time when the first question asked of any birth was, "Is it a boy or a girl?" A physician's signature was more than a formality in the 19th century. It was a legal and moral affirmation. It was a guarantee of service rendered, a testament that a life had begun under his professional watch. To withhold it was to, in a sense, deny the event itself. Dr. Whitcomb's refusal to sign the Hensley birth records suggests a profound discomfort, something that went beyond the usual hardships and anomalies of frontier medicine. His silence extends beyond the public ledger and into his private papers, which were preserved after his death in 1904. A small leather-bound diary remains, its pages mostly filled with mundane details, weather conditions, travel notes, reminders of debts owed. Only a handful of entries refer to patients, and those do so sparingly. But on one page, dated April 1885, a single line stands out, written in a larger, more forceful hand than the surrounding text. It reads, "Unnatural symmetry of skull. No patient's name is attached, no details of age or condition are provided. The phrase is alone, isolated on the page and underlined twice. What did Dr. Whitcomb see in that farmhouse that compelled him to write those words? Rural physicians were accustomed to birth defects, to stillbirths, to the tragic deformities that medical science of the time could not correct. These were documented, sometimes with sorrow, but always with clinical detachment." Yet Whitcomb's reaction was different. He did not document, he retreated. The unsigned ledgers and the cryptic diary entries suggest he encountered something that fell outside his understanding of human biology, something that he was unwilling to put his name to. The repercussions of Dr. Whitcomb's medical silence rippled outward, further muddying the official record of the Hensley family. Hospital archives in the nearby town of Warrensburg include letters of complaint from parish officials at St. Matthew's, noting the doctor's persistent reluctance to provide birth certificates for Hensley children. One priest remarked in frustration, "He leaves me nothing to enter in the register. The children appear, yet no attestation accompanies them." Without a physician's signature, the baptism records themselves floated without anchor, which may explain some of the duplication and confusion in the parish logs. The church could not create a coherent record if the medical authority refused to provide the foundational facts. Colleagues of Whitcomb later hinted at his deep-seated unease. In a surviving affidavit, written decades later by a fellow practitioner for a county inquiry, he describes Whitcomb's steadfast silence when asked about the family. "He would only shake his head," the affidavit reads. Once he remarked that the children were difficult to distinguish, and that he would not be made to put his name upon them. The phrase, "put his name upon them," is telling. It suggests an act of creation or validation, as if signing the birth certificate would make him complicit in something he found profoundly wrong. It is exceptionally rare for an absence of evidence to carry more weight than its presence. Yet here, the blank spaces in Whitcomb's ledgers have become their own kind of testimony. In a book where hundreds of families are neatly accounted for, the Hensleys remain as half-lines, incomplete notations, and erased signatures. The story of their existence is not written in what was affirmed, but in what a man of science steadfastly refused to confirm. What could a physician, trained to observe and document the mechanics of the human body, have seen that would lead him to abandon his professional duty. The phrase from his diary, "unnatural symmetry of skull," offers a chilling clue. Symmetry is a fundamental principle of biology, but unnatural symmetry implies a perfection that is not found in nature. Human bodies are inherently asymmetrical. A face, a skull, is never a perfect mirror image of itself. Was Whitcomb observing a degree of bilateral symmetry so pronounced that it struck him as inhuman? This detail, combined with his refusal to sign birth records, paints a picture of a man deeply shaken by his clinical observations. He was not confronted with a simple deformity, which he would have noted and moved on from. He was confronted with a pattern, a recurring, inexplicable symmetry that seemed to be a hallmark of the Hensley bloodline. His actions, the blotting out of his signature, the trailing off of his pen, the cryptic notes, are the actions of a man at the edge of his rational understanding. He chose to leave a void in the record rather than describe what he saw, perhaps out of fear of ridicule from his peers, or perhaps out of a deeper, more primal fear. Why would a doctor, a pillar of logic and reason in a rural community, deliberately create gaps in the official chronicle of life and death? The answer may lie not in what was wrong with the Hensley children, but in what was, from a biological standpoint, terrifyingly perfect. In 19th-century America, county courthouses were the backbone of legal identity. Their dusty, cavernous record rooms held the documents that defined a family's place in society: marriage licenses, probate filings, and land deeds. These papers established the legitimacy of bloodlines, binding names together in the state's memory. For most rural households, these records offer a clear, branching chain of kinship. A wedding is recorded, children are born in its aftermath, and land is passed from one surname to another as daughters marry and move away. But the courthouse records for the Hensley family defy this sequence. They show a bloodline that doesn't branch, but instead folds inward, circling back on itself in a way that legally and socially makes no sense. A comprehensive search through Johnson County's marriage ledgers between 1860 and 1900 reveals hundreds of licenses issued to farming families. The pages show the familiar, intricate weave of community life, with surnames interlacing as one family's daughter marries into a neighboring household, creating ties of kinship that could be tracked across decades. But in this vast tapestry, the Hensley name appears only in isolation. Not once is a Hensley officially paired with an outsider. There are no marriage certificates binding them to neighboring families, no legal documents acknowledging an exchange of vows with anyone beyond their own name. The family exists as its own closed loop. And yet, the birth records tell another story entirely, a story of continuous propagation that the legal documents cannot account for. While the marriage ledgers are silent, the parish baptismal logs cry out with the names of child after child. Their mothers are consistently named Hensley. Their fathers are occasionally noted, but more often, the line is simply left blank. When a father's name is provided, it too is Hensley. The effect is one of genealogical collapse. Instead of a family tree branching outward into a wider web of community relations, the Hensley tree seems to fold inward on itself. Probate court filings, which document the transfer of property after death, only intensify this strangeness. In most families, estate settlements list multiple heirs, often bearing different surnames as daughters married and dispersed. For the Hensleys, the probate records reveal only repetition. An estate is left to a John Hensley, and a generation later, it is left to a Thomas Hensley, but with no clear indication of generational distance or relationship. The same first names appear decade after decade, as if legal identity itself had stagnated. Frustrated clerks attempted to impose some kind of order. Several entries in the 1880s show hasty, penciled notations like assumed son or possibly nephew. These clarifications, however, are dead ends. Later records make no distinction between uncle, father, or cousin. All were simply and interchangeably Hensley. Without marriage certificates to anchor the relationships, the lines between generations blurred into an incomprehensible tangle. A child might be listed as the heir to a man who was legally recognized in another document as his brother, while a third document might quietly refer to the same man as his father. The legal record, designed for precision, dissolves into a state of perpetual ambiguity. Genealogists who later examined these archives described the Hensley records as a closed system. Unlike other families whose names and bloodlines extended into nearby counties through marriage, the Hensleys appear entirely self-contained, their genetic and legal identity never diluted by union with the outside world. One historian, reviewing land transfers, noted that parcels of the Hensley farmstead were always sold or transferred within the family name, often quietly and without a formal deed, suggesting a concerted effort to keep the bloodline and property intact, unbroken, and untouched by outside claimants. This sense of extreme insularity was confirmed by the faint traces of oral memory. Neighbors, when interviewed, often remarked that the Hensleys kept to their own. But when pressed for detail, the phrase yielded nothing more. Did it simply mean they avoided social gatherings, or did it point to something more binding, a social and genetic isolation so complete that it violated the fundamental norms of community life? The absence of documented spouses makes it impossible to tell. The family tree that should branch outward into a complex pattern of kinship instead collapses into a single, repeating stalk. Children are born without verifiable unions. Names are duplicated across generations. Probate lines are written as though fathers, brothers, and sons were legally interchangeable. To trace the Hensley family through the official records of the state is to follow a circle that never widens, only repeats. It leaves behind a chilling and fundamental question that the law was never designed to ask. How did a bloodline continue, year after year, child after child, without a single marriage license to account for them? Education in 19th century Missouri was a fragile enterprise, often confined to one-room schoolhouses where a single, beleaguered instructor taught children of all ages. Attendance was sporadic, dictated more by the demands of farm labor and the unpredictability of the weather than by state law. For most families, school records are simple markers of presence: a name written in chalk, attendance noted in ink, a brief assessment of a child's progress in reading and arithmetic. But in the case of the Hensley children, these records tell a story not of progress, but of a deeply unsettling indistinction. The attendance rolls of District School Number 4 list Hensley children year after year, but the pattern is fractured and confusing. In 1885, 5 children are enrolled under the name Hensley, with the first names Samuel, Mary, Thomas, Sarah, and John written in a hurried script. The following week, the teacher struck through 2 of the names and replaced them with others, though the total count of Hensley children remained the same. By the end of the month, the frustrated teacher abandoned names altogether. The ledger simply reads, Hensley X5, with the annotation, indistinct. Teachers' notes, preserved in dusty boxes in the county archives, reveal the profound frustration behind such shorthand. One instructor, a Mrs. Clara Wright, recorded in her private journal in 1887, "They answer to any name. When I call for Sarah to rise, another stands. When I mark Thomas absent, he is here but says he is John. The children exchange names without correction, without laughter. I cannot keep order." Her observation is clinical, not whimsical. Her tone betrays not a sense of childhood mischief, but of witnessing the dissolution of individual identity in a classroom that was meant to affirm it. Other reports from a string of short-lived teachers at the district school corroborate Mrs. Wright's experience. In 1891, another teacher wrote a letter to the county superintendent, stating, "The Hensley children are interchangeable. Appearance is close, behavior is mirrored. I cannot distinguish the eldest from the youngest. I am marking them present in aggregate." The phrasing suggests not negligence, but resignation. It was an educator reducing a family to a collective presence rather than a group of discrete individuals, a tacit admission that the basic tools of her profession, calling a roll, assigning a task to a specific child, had failed. This strangeness extended beyond names and into their very actions. Witness accounts from fellow pupils, gathered years later, describe the Hensleys' uncanny tendency to finish each other's recitations. A boy beginning to read aloud from a primer would falter, only for another Hensley child, seated clear across the room, to continue the passage in the exact same cadence, without missing a beat, as if a single mind were operating two bodies. Arithmetic exercises copied onto slates appeared identical, down to the formation of the numbers, even when the problems were assigned separately. One surviving slate board, now held in the County Museum, contains two sets of handwriting attributed to two different Hensley children. A curator's note states that forensic analysis found the chalk strokes to be statistically indistinguishable. This mirroring created an impossible situation in disciplinary matters. Teachers attempting to punish misbehavior reported extreme difficulty in assigning blame. When one child was accused of whispering, 3 others would calmly claim responsibility, repeating the same words until the entire class dissolved into a state of bewildered confusion. School detention logs note that on more than one occasion, the Hensleys were kept after class not as individuals, but as a group. The entry simply lists them as the Hensley set. Such patterns eroded the very purpose of 19th-century schooling, which was, at its core, an exercise in separation, categorization, and measurement. Education sought to distinguish one child from another, to rank them, to grade them, to mold them into unique, productive citizens. The Hensley children seemed to resist this process at a fundamental level. They collapsed the distinctions that the schoolhouse was built to create. The result was not chaos in the traditional sense. They were not described as disruptive or violent, but a quiet, profound nullification of individuality. Overwhelmed instructors gave up trying to separate them, reducing their entries to collective marks, and surrendering to the family's inherent indistinctness rather than continuing to record a false precision. Eventually, the institution of education, like the census and the church before it, chose exclusion over accommodation. By the mid-1890s, school records show that some Hensley children were refused enrollment altogether. A superintendent's report from 1894 makes a veiled reference to the issue, mentioning the difficulty of managing families whose records are so indistinguishable as to produce untenable duplication within the official registers. Though the Hensley name is not explicitly cited, the implication is clear. Without verifiable individual attendance, without the ability to track the progress of a single child, the Hensleys were effectively excluded from the educational record, mirroring the erasures that had already occurred in every other aspect of their documented lives. What remains today are the fragments, ledgers with names struck through, margins filled with the word indistinct, and the desperate notes of teachers who were confronted by children who mirrored each other so perfectly that even their handwriting refused to be separated. Medical anomalies were not uncommon in the 19th century. In an era before genetic science, physicians documented unusual births and congenital conditions with a mixture of clinical curiosity and morbid fascination. They presented case studies to their peers, published findings in medical journals, and sometimes preserved anatomical specimens in glass jars for the instruction of future doctors. Abnormality was something to be cataloged, displayed, and if possible, explained. Yet in the case of the Hensley family, the anomalies did not enter the public record. They appear only in hidden fragments, sketches tucked into forgotten folders, notes without signatures, and anatomical drawings concealed in the backs of ledgers, as if their discovery was something to be ashamed of. One such surviving sketch, found in the basement archives of a now-defunct county hospital, depicts the skeleton of a boy identified only by the initial H. The rendering is careful and clinical. It shows a human torso with an extra pair of ribs, one on each side, aligned with perfect symmetry at the base of the spine. Several vertebrae in the lumbar region are drawn with precision, showing they are fused together. Next to this, in a physician's elegant hand, is a 2-word annotation, mirror growth. No diagnosis follows. No prognosis is offered. The page is unsigned, its edges browned and brittle from years of concealment. This was not a document meant for publication. It was a secret record, a piece of evidence hidden away from the world of established medical science. And it was not the only one. Another file from the same hospital, dated 1889, describes a Hensley child born with duplicated digits. The physician's notes, written in ink that has faded to a rusty brown, read, "Left hand presents 6 digits, right hand likewise 6. Both are mirror-formed, the central finger identical in proportion to its counterpart." Such cases, a condition known as polydactyly, were rare but not unknown in the period. They were typically documented and published as fascinating examples of nature's occasional errors. Yet here, the anomaly was not circulated to medical journals. The record was quietly stored, never referenced in official hospital reports, and buried in an unindexed file. Witness accounts from midwives and neighbors record more subtle, but equally symmetrical, repetitions. A midwife who attended several Hensley births wrote in a letter to her sister of infants born with double crowns of hair, 2 distinct whorls spiraling in opposite directions on the scalp. Another child was said to display a bilateral symmetry, so pronounced that even the freckles on their face appeared to be mirrored across the cheeks, each dark mark on the left side duplicated with uncanny precision on the right. These details, small and perhaps dismissible in isolation, accumulated into a pattern that deeply unsettled medical observers. The critical question is, why were these anomalies hidden? In most circumstances, physicians sought professional recognition for such discoveries. Documenting unusual cases elevated a doctor's reputation, proved the breadth of their practice, and contributed to the expanding body of medical knowledge. Yet the Hensley sketches and notes were not shared. They remained concealed in the hospital basement, pressed between blank pages or scribbled onto loose sheets without names or dates, as if their author was afraid of being associated with them. The silence of the medical professionals is more telling than any formal diagnosis could be. In one preserved letter, a physician from a neighboring county, who had been consulted on a Hensley case, explains his hesitation to a colleague in St. Louis. "I refrain from forwarding this case to the journal," he writes, "for the likeness to prior reports from this family is too exact. The deformities repeat across siblings, and I am told, across generations. It is no longer a singular curiosity but systemic. I fear professional ridicule. The implication is clear and staggering. These were not isolated, random instances of congenital disorders. This was a family pattern. The same symmetrical, mirrored anomalies were appearing generation after generation. Such a phenomenon resisted the medical frameworks of the time, which expected anomalies to arise by chance, not to persist with the predictable certainty of an inheritance. The atmosphere in these hidden records is cold and clinical, but it is underlined by a palpable sense of avoidance. One document contains a meticulously sketched skull, annotated with the phrase, "facial halves near identical." The line is underlined twice, then aggressively erased, the graphite smudged as though rubbed out with a panicked thumb. Even in a forensic rendering, hesitation intrudes. By the 1890s, the local hospital effectively stopped accepting Hensley cases. Admission records show a sudden, unexplained gap. No entries appear under the family name. No treatments for illness, no surgeries, no births. The family, once observed with secret fascination, was now left completely unrecorded. The anomalies they carried, whatever they were, disappeared into an institutional silence. What remains today are not diagnoses but discarded drawings. Ribs counted twice, digits mirrored, crowns spiraled in perfect symmetry, evidence not affirmed, only hidden away. The Hensley farmstead sat at the edge of cleared land, bordered by dense woods that seldom appeared on county maps. It was there in 1902 that a team of surveyors, tasked with establishing new property boundaries for the railroad, first noted an unmarked plot of ground. It was a slight depression in the soil, roughly rectangular, lined by leaning fieldstones that bore no inscriptions. The discovery was incidental, a footnote in their official report. Yet what lay beneath that patch of neglected soil would deepen the mystery already surrounding the family, providing a grim, subterranean confirmation of the patterns seen in the living. No official burial records exist for the Hensley family in county or church registers. While parish ledgers list baptisms and occasionally deaths, the space for funeral rites is conspicuously absent. At first, this was explained away as a common rural custom. Isolated families often buried their dead privately on homestead ground. But the number of depressions in the soil and the sheer quantity of stones suggested far more than a simple family plot. A quiet exhumation, carried out in 1905 by local officials acting on a sealed county order, revealed not a handful of burials but dozens. The coffins were not laid out in neat rows but stacked in layers, one on top of another, a chaotic stratigraphy of death. In some cases, the pine wood had collapsed inward under the weight of the earth, pressing the remains into unnatural, contorted positions. Yet, when the bones were carefully excavated and examined, the effect was less chaotic than chillingly orderly. The skulls, when lined side by side, bore a resemblance so remarkable that it defied explanation. The eye sockets, the angle of the jaw, the slope of the nasal bone, all appeared nearly identical. One official's report, now brittle with age, remarked, "The resemblance is such that we cannot distinguish father from son, nor brother from brother. Each skull echoes the next." The eerie repetition discovered in the unmarked cemetery extended beyond the skulls. Several of the skeletons exhumed displayed the same symmetrical anomalies that had been secretly sketched by Dr. Whitcomb years earlier. An extra set of ribs, perfectly mirrored across the torso. Vertebrae fused in a parallel formation. In one layered grave, two sets of remains, separated by decades of soil and decaying coffin wood, were found to have the exact same rare abnormality in the bones of the inner ear, as though one body had been buried twice in the same spot. The discovery deeply unsettled the men tasked with recording it. The county coroner's log, typically a spare, emotionless document, contains a rare note of hesitation. Beside the Hensley entry, he wrote, "Remains duplicative. No certain generational distinction possible." The phrasing betrays the core of the problem. In an exhumation, time and decomposition are supposed to help separate the bodies, to establish a timeline of death. Here, time seemed to collapse. Attempts to date the burials by analyzing coffin construction and nail types brought no clarity. An iron-nailed coffin suggested a burial from the 1870s, yet the bones inside bore the same condition as a skeleton exhumed from a wire-nailed coffin built in the 1890s. The wood types varied, but the faces of the dead remained the same. Without inscriptions, without markers, and without parish entries, there was no way to order them, no way to construct a family tree from the bones. They were simply a collection of identicals. The soil held only repetition, faces duplicated in death as they had been in life, generations indistinguishable, anomalies mirrored, and individual identity completely erased by an overwhelming, terrifying sameness. The Hensley family did not exist in a vacuum. Their farmstead bordered other parcels of land, and for decades, their lives must have intersected with those of neighboring families at markets, churches, and on the dusty roads of Johnson County. Yet, when the historical record turns outward, when investigators and oral historians sought to gather testimony from the surrounding community, the response was strikingly and uniformly one of silence. It was a wall of refusal so complete that it became a form of evidence in itself. In the oral histories collected during the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration, a project designed to preserve the memories of ordinary Americans, dozens of accounts describe life in Johnson County in vivid detail. They speak of immigrant farmers, former Confederate soldiers, and widows raising children on their own. But when the name Hensley is raised by the interviewer, the record shifts abruptly. Rich, detailed responses shrink to single, terse sentences, or are cut short or are omitted from the transcript entirely. One interviewer noted his frustration in his field journal. Respondents shake their heads when the name is mentioned. Some cross themselves. None will offer any detail. This absence of description, repeated across dozens of sources, stands out more starkly than any vivid memory could. It suggests a communal agreement, an unspoken pact to not speak of the family on the southern boundary. This was not a failure of memory, it was a refusal to remember. This communal evasion is reflected in other local records. The Warrensburg Standard, the county newspaper that routinely reported on births, deaths, farm auctions, and even minor social gatherings, carries no mention of the Hensley family between 1870 and 1910. Yet census documents, however confused, confirm that their numbers should have qualified them for notice. Marriages, school events, and obituaries for their neighbors earned a line or two of print. In the case of the Hensleys, silence prevailed. Where their neighbors were named, photographed, and praised for bountiful harvests, the Hensleys were simply not there. The faint traces that do survive exist in local folklore, passed down as warnings to children. In an account recorded by a county teacher in 1908, she recalls children in her class speaking of warnings from their parents. Do not go near the ones who look the same. The phrase recurs in different variations, the same ones, the repeating ones. Yet the warning was never expanded upon, never explained. Parents who uttered it reportedly refused further questions, relying on a stern look and a repeated gesture to enforce the boundary. The silence was not just practiced by individuals, it was enforced by institutions. Teachers who attempted to discuss their strange experiences with the Hensley children reported receiving little support from their superiors. One superintendent's letter dismisses a teacher's complaint with the chillingly vague phrase, "It is not for us to dwell upon them." Clergy responded in similar terms, urging parishioners not to spread talk. Sociologists who have studied the case a century later describe this phenomenon as a form of collective erasure. A community often perpetuates memory through storytelling. Here, a memory was maintained through the active refusal to tell a story. By not speaking of the Hensleys, the community preserved them in negative space, a family known precisely because they were never described. Among the scattered fragments that remain of the Hensley family, none carries more disquieting power than a pair of photographs, separated by nearly 2 decades. They were found in different collections, mislabeled, and only compared long after the family itself had vanished from the landscape. Together, they present an image that has unsettled every archivist and historian who has studied them, a visual paradox that defies time itself. The first photograph dates to 1883, the same year the census taker resigned. It is a standard rural portrait of a young boy, estimated to be around 12 or 13 years old, sitting stiffly in a wooden chair. His hair is cut bluntly across his brow, his expression is neutral, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the lens. Scratched into the lower margin of the plate is the single word, Hensley. The second photograph is dated 1901. It surfaced in a private collection decades later, having been taken in the same region, though by a different photographer. It shows another boy, also labeled Hensley. The backdrop is different, the chair is of another style, but the figure seated in it is identical. Not similar, identical. The same blunt haircut, the same posture, the same faint droop at the corner of the mouth. 18 years separate the two exposures, yet the subject appears to have been frozen in adolescence, untouched by the passage of time. When the two images are placed side by side, they defy the normal drift of family resemblance. This is not likeness. This is a perfect, impossible repetition, captured by the cold, impartial eye of the camera. The photographs became the ultimate proof of the very thing everyone had refused to document, the family that did not change. In 1895, the Missouri State Board of Health launched a comprehensive inquiry into the health and heredity of its rural population. It was part of a growing national eugenics-adjacent movement to measure the well-being of families in isolated communities, to assess living conditions, and to identify hereditary illnesses that might be passed down through generations. The final report, a thick volume prepared for the state legislature, was meant to be a monument to scientific clarity, filled with charts, statistics, and detailed case summaries from every county. For the Hensley family, it became the site of their most official disappearance yet. The master index of the inquiry lists them plainly. Under the section for Johnson County, a cross-reference mark appears beside their name. See Case 47, Hensley. Yet when researchers turn to the designated page, they find nothing. The pagination of the bound volume inexplicably skips, leaping from Case 46 directly to Case 48. The page for Case 47 does not exist. It is not a simple printer's error. The index explicitly refers to a case that the final, published volume does not contain. In a surviving draft of the report, held in the state archives, the name Hensley appears faintly penciled in the margin beside an outline for a chapter on hereditary anomalies. The note is aggressively crossed out, replaced with a single dismissive dash. Further down the same page, another line is scored through so heavily that the ink bled through to the reverse. Repetition across generations, not explicable by normal inheritance. The state of Missouri had investigated the Hensleys, assigned them a case number, and then, at some point before publication, made the decision to excise them completely from its official history, leaving behind only the ghost of their file number. The last heir of the Hensley mystery surfaced in 1912. A boy was delivered to the state lunatic asylum number 2, initially under a false surname. His file was later corrected, with the word Hensley penciled faintly in the margin by an unknown hand. The admission documents describe him as being 17 years old, though an accompanying note acknowledges deep uncertainty. Subject's stated age is inconsistent with physical appearance. As was customary, photographs were taken upon intake. The surviving prints, held in the asylum's own grim archive, show a boy seated against a blank wall, his hands folded in his lap. His hair falls bluntly over his forehead, his expression is vacant. A second photograph, captured days later, is indistinguishable from the first. Filed under separate exposure numbers, the two prints reveal no variance, no shift in posture, no trace of the passage of days. The intake officer recorded a statement that has become the most cited and chilling fragment of the entire case. When asked for his family name, the boy reportedly said, "I am the fifth of myself." The phrase is underlined twice in the record, followed by the clinical note. Subject repeats this when asked for personal details. When pressed further, the boy allegedly listed other names, John, Thomas, Samuel, but insisted they were all himself. The exasperated clerk entered only, "Identity circular, no clarity." The asylum, an institution designed to categorize and treat mental disorder, found itself utterly unable to classify him. His diagnosis shifts in the file from melancholia to dementia praecox to hysteria of repetition. None of them stick. The progress notes thin quickly, then stop altogether by late 1913. His file concludes with an empty page and the faint pencil mark, "No further record." The last Hensley had been absorbed into the final, perfect silence. The story of the Hensley family survives not in the fullness of a historical record, but in its absences, its voids, and its erasures. Across every archive and institution, their presence is marked only by what cannot be found. The pages struck through in a census ledger, the medical sketches of mirrored bones hidden in a hospital basement, the sermon describing a household that births only itself, reduced to a single, scorched fragment. And the photographs that show the same boy again and again, unchanged across decades, a face immune to the laws of time. Every institution that encountered them, government, church, medicine, and community, looked once and then looked away. What should have been preserved was struck out. What should have been studied was hidden. What should have been remembered was deliberately forgotten. Whether the Hensleys were a tragic accident of isolated genetics or something far more disturbing, a cycle of repetition that our understanding of the world cannot accommodate, the truth has been buried, not by soil, but by an overwhelming, conspiratorial silence. The final question is not what they were, but what their erasure means. If history can conceal an entire family like this, hiding them in the blank spaces between the pages. How many other names, how many other inexplicable truths have been erased in the same way? What do you believe happened to the Hensley family? Was it a genetic anomaly, a shared delusion, or something else entirely? Let me know your theories in the comments below. And if you wish to step deeper into the histories that were never meant to be told, subscribe to our channel where the past leaves no comfort, only questions.